Hi everybody, thanks for being here with us today. My name is Lena Dempapov and I'm just going to talk very quickly and give you a little bit of an introduction to pollination in general before our main speakers take the stage. So first of all, what is pollination? What you're seeing there is a diagram of a flower and there are several components. The petals are the colorful bits that attract the pollinators or would-be pollinators. The style, stigma, and ovary form the female parts, and the anther and the filament form the male parts. So pollination is really the transfer of pollen grains from the male parts, so from the anthers, to the female parts, so which is the stigma. And this happens either by animal, by wind, or by water. The flower that it moves from and to, it could be within the same flower, it could be from one flower to another on the same plant, or it could be from one flower to another flower on a different plant. This is different from fertilization. Fertilization happens after pollination. So during pollination, the pollen grain is moved from the male part to the female part. And during fertilization, the pollen grain that lands on the stigma starts to grow a pollen tube down the style and then eventually fertilizes the ovary and the ovule inside of the female components of the flower in a very simple way. So what's highlighted here is the stigma, that is where the pollen grain should land. And the other highlight on the left-hand side is where the pollen tube grows down and then through the micropyle into the ovule, where the pollen grain is then, or the nucleus inside of the pollen grain then fertilizes the ovule and the ovary. So as already mentioned, there are three types of pollination. They can be done by animal, by wind, or by water. And we're going to talk about animal pollination today specifically. And the pollinators are animals that carry the pollen grains from the anther, which is the male part, to the stigma, which is the female part. And that process is the pollination process and happens by animals that are called pollinators if animals are involved. The motivation is generally food, so I would like to stress this. Animals don't pollinate because they're trying to do flowers a favor. They pollinate because they are motivated by food. So there are different things that animals would collect from these flowers. In some cases, they would collect nectar. In some cases, they would collect pollen grains. Sometimes certain animals also visit plants for other reasons. For example, they would collect some of the resin to make hives with and so on, so for construction purposes, but that does not require accessing flowers. Sometimes animals also visit extrafloral nectaries, so those are nectaries that are not located on flowers, so the motivation is always something for the animals themselves and not for the plant. This relationship is a symbiotic relationship in which both benefit, the flower or plant and the animal. As I'm sure you're aware, we are experiencing globally pollinator declines to very large degrees, and this is generally referred to as the global pollination crisis. There's a global pollinator decline of wild pollinators specifically, and there's an increasing challenge. There are increasing challenges with managed pollinators as well. While generally the number of hives that exist are globally increasing in terms of the honeybee hives and what is managed, people are experiencing a lot more problems, especially in the face of lots of threats such as increased pesticide use, climate change, and so on. So it's becoming more difficult for beekeepers to manage their hives properly in terms of pests and diseases, and other issues such as availability of food with the issues that come about through the changes in the seasons that we're having and so on. People are growing more pollinator dependent crops, so people are growing more things that require animals to pollinate them. And for example, a good example is the vitamin A issue. Many crops that produce vitamin A require animal pollination, and this is something that then can reduce or can result in a nutrition shortage rather than a food shortage. But a food shortage is always something we should be concerned about when we're talking about the decline in pollinators. There's also an increasing human population, and this increases the stresses on pollinators. We require more land, we cut down more land, we require more agricultural space, so we cut down more of the land to grow things, but at the same time, this then removes the habitat for the pollinators, which becomes a problem, again, in terms of the supply of the pollinators creating the food in the first place. It's also important to note that a high pollinator biodiversity always equals a high general biodiversity, just because they're extremely important in maintaining nature in general. The pollinators maintain the plants in turn provide habitat for other species. So pollinators and this whole pollination ecosystem service really underpins all of biodiversity in general. So pollinators include a range of organisms. You might be familiar with bees, butterflies, maybe some other species such as hummingbirds, but there are lots more obscure pollinators out there as well. So several birds, bats, monkeys in some cases pollinate, marsupials, lemurs, bears, rabbits, deer, rodents, bees, wasps, flies, ants, butterflies, and moths. So that's just a list of some of the pollinators out there that have been documented. Of course, there are many others. And even lizards pollinate some plants, as you can see here. So this might be a bit of a strange sight, but they also do their jobs. And generally, when we're talking about factors that are important for successful pollination, enough pollen has to be transferred from the anther to the stigma so that something develops. It implies that the pollinator must carry a sufficient number of pollen grains, and that the pollen is collected and deposited while it's viable, meaning while it's able to fertilize the female plant parts. And that can sometimes just be a very small time window. Pollen is not modified for or during transport, so many bee species actually, mostly the social bees, like to chew the pollen grains and stick it to their legs. That might be good for their food, but it's not good for pollination. So the pollen grains that are used for pollination are those that are stuck to other body parts by accident. Pollinator visits flower of the same species in sequence, so it's important that the pollinator visits the flower of the same species over and over rather than go to different species. For example, if it's visiting a cucumber flower, it's important that it continues visiting more cucumber flowers in succession so that it transfers the pollen grains to the right plants. If you have a pollinator that goes from cucumber to watermelon to squash to something else, then you will not get the pollen being deposited on the right plant. It's important that the pollinator possesses physiological features that allow for the transport of pollen. This can often be composed of body hairs, certain structures that are wider, certain body parts, and just the general shape in which it accesses the flower. It sort of is often like a lock and key situation. Bees are shorter and flatter, and they can fit into shorter, flatter flowers, versus hummingbirds, for example, that have a long beak, or even butterflies that have a very long proboscis. They tend to access plants that have tubular flowers. So that really depends on the pollinator. And the pollinator is capable of traveling distance required between plants. So it's very important that the pollinator that visits flowers or pollinates flowers that where plants might be far apart, that they can actually cover that distance and fly as far as that. Right, so this brings me to the end of my very short presentation. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of what's to come. Thank you very much.